too late. So hi everybody, welcome to Bard Graduate Center's Brown Bag Lecture Series. My name is Alicia Boswell. I'm a Mellon Cultures of Conservation postdoctoral fellow here at VGC. I'm delighted to introduce today's Brown Bag speaker, Dr. Jeffrey Quilter, who is currently a research fellow here at VGC. He is the William and Muriel Seabury Howells Director of the Peabody Museum of Archaeology and Ethnology at Harvard University, and is a senior lecturer in the Department of Anthropology. Prior to his current appointment, he also held positions as Deputy Director for Curatorial Affairs and Curator of Intermediate Area Archaeology at the Peabody. He has also served as the Director of Pre-Columbian Studies and Curator of Pre-Columbian Collections at Dumbarton Oaks Research Library and Collections, as well as was on the faculty at Ripon College in the Department of Anthropology and Sociology. Born and raised in New York City, and I know he's thrilled to be back in the city for this term. He completed his undergraduate studies at the University of Chicago and graduate work at UC Santa Barbara. Trained as an anthropological archaeologist, his early research examined questions of the origins of Semitism and complex societies in Peru. Later research is focused on the art and iconography of the Moche culture of Peru, as well as ceremonial and mortuary practices of pre-Columbian Costa Rica. Since 2002, he's collaborated with Peruvian colleagues at the El Brujo Archaeological Complex on Peru's north coast, which has pre-ceramic through colonial period occupations. And today, he will be sharing some of his findings from the 16th and 17th century colonial town and church from the site. Of course, while this project is in its write-up stage, Jeffrey has already moved on to new field work. He's most recently examining, and I understand this project is still in data collection phase, the impact of climate and the environment on complex societies in the north coast of Peru. His extensive research projects have been supported by the National Endowment of the Humanities, the National Science Foundation, Wenner-Gren, National Geographic Society, among other institutions. And at the Peabody and Dumbarton Oaks, he curated multiple exhibits on pre-Columbian cultures and its history of research, including the Moche of Ancient Peru, Media Messages at the Peabody, and the exhibit Incidents of Travel, Robert Wood's Bliss in Yucatan and Central America, 1935, at Dumbarton Oaks. His publications are as diverse and varied as his research, and I'll just highlight his most recent books, which include a volume co-edited with Luis Jaime Castillo titled New Perspectives on Moche Political Organization, and a new textbook on the ancient Central Andes. I also want to mention that he edited a special issue in the Journal of Res, Anthropology and Aesthetics with Bard Graduate Center faculty member Ivan Gaskell, titled Museums Crossing Boundaries, among his many, many other publications. Today I'll be speaking on his multidisciplinary study of the 16th and 17th century colonial town and church complex, Santa Magdalena de Viejo. Study of the archaeological record of the colonial era in Peru is a new frontier in Andean archaeology, and personally, as an Andean archaeologist, I'm looking forward to hearing about this very important project today. And so today's talk is entitled The Archaeology and History of Colonial Peru, the Case of Magdalena de Viejo. Please join me in welcoming Jeffrey Quilter.
Thank you, Alicia, and thanks to one and all for coming. I hear it's beautiful outside, so I'll not keep you too long. And before I begin, I would like to offer my heartfelt thanks to Susan Weber, the director of the Bard Graduate Center, and to Peter Miller, the dean, and to my many colleagues, especially Ivan Gaskell, my friend from Harvard, and especially to the staff of the BGC for being so welcoming and so gracious to me and to my wife, who's here with me today, both professionally and in terms of our housing and everything else. It's really an honor and a privilege to be here. I find the BGC one of the most exciting places I know of for the kinds of things we're all interested in and talking about today, and so I'm very, very pleased to be here, and I really am grateful for the opportunity. And I also want to recognize that I see there are many, many specialists who know a lot more about some of these things than I do, so bear with me because we have a general audience as well, and so I want to begin by giving some context of the site of the project, which is why I titled this as The Archaeology and History and the Case Study of Magdalena de Viejo. Let's see if this works. There we go. Now, it is interesting to consider that 2 or 3 generations ago, the view of the encounter, as it was popularly called in the 1990s, between the old world and new, was seen as a great romantic expedition. Go back to the 1950s, and you can see many movies usually starring Victor Mature, such as Captains from Castile and so forth and so on. And this is a very common understanding, still I think in some quarters, of what that conquest was all about. And it's partly in contrast to that my work has taken place. The other night we had a lecture here by Professor Morphy, who was talking about how generalistic and simplistic ideas about the primitive art and Australian art are much more complicated than they are often portrayed to be in terms of the past, and the same is true in the era we're talking about. And one of those common tropes is that the conquest of Peru in particular happened relatively quickly, happened in that beautiful valley behind us there when Francisco Pizarro met Inca Atahualpa in November of 1532, captured him, held him for ransom, and then within a year finally killed him, and then marched on to Cusco, the Inca capital, where the Spanish reigned supreme. Story, of course, is much more complicated and involved, and rather than being an episode that took place only in a matter of a year or two or even 5, the conquest of Peru, and I would say it was a conquest, we have to face the fact that it was a conquest, actually took about 2 generations. And why did it happen? How did it happen? Again, a common story is it was superior European weapons, it was European diseases, it was the influence of the church, or the story is portrayed as, again, this grand epic of the triumph of Christianity, and any even slight delving into the story reveals that it was a much more complex, much more contentious, and much more drawn-out event than perhaps the general public realizes, and as the story is commonly told. Now, when that story is told, how is it told? Well, it's commonly told, and most of our sources that are easily available have been through documents and through written records. Those written by the Spanish, and many now being written by, now being found, and some longer known than others, by native peoples who were working the difficult position of being high-ranking native peoples within a Spanish society, one of whom was Juan Poma de Ayala. Every Andeanist commonly draws upon images from his 1,000-page letter to the King of Spain, complaining about Spanish atrocities to Native Americans. And these are indeed rich sources, as are increasingly done by historians, documents on court cases and other records that are available that now do enrich us about life beyond the grand narratives that are being told, that were told by the conquistadors. Nevertheless, those narratives tend to be relatively narrow, and they're told, of course, from a very specific point of view of individual authors who had their own agendas to fulfill in terms of their personal ambitions and their personal gripes, as well as their views of history and how it took place. And just to expand a little bit in terms of that story of those 2 generations, from about 1532, when the Spanish arrive in Peru with in arms, till about the 1570s, the historian Karen Spalding has commonly described that period as one in which a plunder economy existed. The wealth of Peru was ripped off the walls of temples, pulled out of the graves of venerated ancestors, and shipped back to Spain. And in that 40-year period, there was a constant turmoil, not only between native peoples and the Spaniards, but also among the Spaniards themselves. It is worth considering in an age when we can call anyone on the phone around the world instantaneously, that in the 16th century, it took 6 months to travel from Lima to the court in Spain. And then once you got there, if you had an audience, you'd have to wait. if you were lucky, and then 6 months to travel back. Consequently, the ability to manage the imperial domains on the other side of the world was very difficult indeed, and it allowed opportunistic adventurers such as Pizarro's brothers, among others, and his discontented generals to wind up in virtual civil wars. It must have been a very interesting world to live in which the native peoples could sit on hillsides and watch the Spaniards fight each other. Although commonly, of course, they were drawn into the battles themselves. Things changed rather dramatically in 1571 when the fifth Viceroy of Peru, fifth by then, by the way, think of that, Francisco Toledo arrived. And Toledo in the 19th century was portrayed in European literature, at least, as the great savior of Peru in finally stabilizing it. He didn't have such a savory reputation at the time, however, because he captured the last Inca ruler who was hiding out in the jungles below Machu Picchu and brought him back to Cusco and executed him. And he was severe upon native peoples, but on the other hand, he did establish a kind of stability that had been lacking up to then. And one of the things he instituted more vigorously than before was the pulling in of native peoples from around the countryside who had mostly been living in their traditional places, close to the land, in small communities spread across the landscape, into towns of Spanish plan, under Spanish dominion, and dominated not only by Spanish civil authorities, but often left to the control and teachings of the clergy. And these Spanish communities, Spanish organized communities, are known as reducciones in Spanish. As Tom Cummins has pointed out, my colleague at Harvard, the term reduction is, if you think about cooking in which you take a liquid and reduce it, it's in that sense that the term reduction is. It's a concentrating of people along the landscapes. And these reducciones, many of them are now continued through history and became modern day towns. Now, our focus today is on one of these reducciones, or at least a community that is the result of a reducción, in the Chicama Valley. The Chicama Valley is on the north coast of Peru, and here it is contextualized within the larger South America. It's in this narrow strip of desert. Just to remember, the coast of Peru is a dramatic landscape in being a desert with parallel river valleys entering the Pacific, which are oases in the desert, and then the Andes Mountains, sometimes within a very short walking distance to the east, and then the tropical forest on the other side. And this is the Chicama Valley looking from about the northeast, which I think gives the best view. So the modern town of Trujillo, I think it's now the third largest city in Peru, is here on the coast, which is where the local Spaniards established a major center. It's named after Pizarro's hometown in Spain. And the Chicama Valley, as many coastal valleys, is a broad fan-like strip of green or area of green, the result of irrigation agriculture, both in pre-Hispanic times and maintained in the colonial period and to today. And Magdalena de Cal, the place we're most interested in, is right here, right next to the coast, on a raised terrace that resembles, we like to say, South America in general, and is a fascinating region because it is a 1 square kilometer that contains over 5,000 years, perhaps 12,000 years of cultural development, going from the earliest, or very early at least, occupations. Actually, the archaeologist Tom Dillehay of Vanderbilt University claims that he's got the earliest dates for the human occupation of South America there, currently at about 12,000 years. It's sort of debated, still being determined, but it's certainly a very, very early occupation, and was a important site because back in the 1940s, Junius Bird, who used to work 2 blocks from here, excavated there and defined this ancient pre-ceramic occupation of Peru that stretched well deep into the past. But in addition to this very early occupation, the site of the complex of El Brujo, as it's called, is perhaps most noted for two very large ancient temples that are now earthen mounds, one called the Huaca Cortada and the other one called Huaca Cal Viejo. Cal, by the way, is probably an ancient word in a local language that may mean something like valley. Now, we know from the historical records that in 1578 there was a massive El Nino event. Interestingly enough, giving this talk, say 10 or 15 years ago, one might have to explain El Nino. We now all know what an El Nino is. And the El Nino is perhaps amongst its most severest manifestations along the north coast of Peru, where the dry desert regime is turned upside down and rain falls on the coast, causing disaster for local people, and droughts occur in the highlands, which is not good for highlanders either. We have it on record about this El Nino. It was so devastating that a commission was sent about 2 years later, in about 1580s, to the north coast to investigate how bad the damage was, and it was still recovering about 7 years later when I think the commission actually went up. And this quote is from that commission's report, that at the time of these great rains, the people of Cal, which had been an earlier 1560s reduction located in the valley, fled to this high place that was a place where they sought refuge, and that was a place where their ancestors had lived. And there's no other place in the valley that matches that description. So by that alone, we could be fairly confident that the second Magdalena de Cal, the refugee community, is at El Brujo. There's further support because local townspeople have for generations said that that's where their ancestors lived. And this is the Huaca Cal Viejo, the Moche, temple, dating to circa AD 300 to 700, more or less. And when the Magdalena people went to this high place, they stayed. And they did two things. They built a town, which is roughly where these two people are walking. Actually, not roughly, exactly where these two people are walking, and this entire area. And they built a church complex, and that church complex is this rise right in front of the temple. And our work was able to demonstrate that the church was built in the old plaza of the Moche Temple, which was clearly, for reasons I could explain during questions, venerated at the time of the Spanish occupation. So even in 1578, and even though that Huaca, as they're called, was a ruin, this was still a sacred place that was respected by local people. And so the location of the temple there is probably seen by the Spanish as an example of the triumph of Christianity over paganism, but very likely was seen by local people as a reinforcement of the sacrality of the location. There we go. Now here's an aerial view thanks to Google, and here is the Huaca Cal Viejo. Here is the Huaca Cortada. They're about 500 meters apart from one another, and thanks to the wonders of aerial photography, you can even see this washboard-like effect here in the map is the actual streets of the town of Magdalena that was built on a plain in the flat area beyond the temple precincts and the church. You can even see the outlines of the church complex right here. And so we began work there in 2000. We did a little bit of work in 2004, and the first thing we did was you always need to know where the corners are. Which is true in the city as well as in the country. And so this is the church, outlines of the actual church itself. This is the church complex, and this red circle here, it's a little off actually, marks the corner that was the corner both of the Moche Plaza, and it was refurbished as the corner of the church complex. And so we dug a pit on the corner just to make sure we knew where it was, and found some interesting murals. Did a little work. Now, our Peruvian colleagues with whom we worked had also done a little exploratory excavation in previous years, although they had not had a strong interest in the colonial excavation, so they colonial period. So they just wanted to check out generally what was there. We cleaned out some of their old pits, found fragments of fallen painted wall pasts from inside the nave of the church, the nave being the central worship area, and then did more general excavations to expose the entire nave structure and define the various buildings within the complex and potentially identify their function. This shows you, here's the temple complex. This is the outlines of one of the multiple stages and of course this being mostly the last stage of the temple plaza. And here's the church nave, and then there was a atrium, a sort of open courtyard for gathering before or after church over here, and then various buildings over here to maintain the church operations. This is a view of the nave. Here now we're looking with north to the top. Here are various church buildings, including a bakery, kitchens, 2 ovens over here, and then the nave is the main area for worship in the church. This room over here is a sacristy where the priest would have a sort of office and a place to change into his vestments. And this is a baptistry for the baptizing of the population. We worked basically a lot in clearing out old excavation pits and old looters' pits. Unfortunately, this area has been extensively looted, probably since colonial times. It only stopped relatively recently when a Peruvian foundation basically took over management for the Peruvian government of the complex, and it has safeguarded the site so that looting has stopped. But we cleaned out this rather large looter's pit, and underneath what would have been the floor of the church in its northwestern corner, we found the remains of about 23 individuals who had been buried under the floor of the church, and who were, based upon DNA evidence and general forensic evidence, these were probably high-ranking native local people who had converted to Christianity, and because of their status were buried under the floor of the church. This bead dates it to the early, one of these individuals to the early colonial period. And so that's one great set of evidence we have for the population. In addition, even though the town cemetery, which was right next to the church, was extremely looted, we basically picked up human bones that were scattered on the site. We found 80 cubic meters of human remains scattered around the site, and only one intact burial, being of this woman here, who, as you can tell from the outline, was buried in a traditional Andean position of a flex burial, wrapped in textiles, and with a small bag containing materials for her weaving with her. So the evidence is always difficult to deal with because of this severe looting that's occurred at the site. Here again is an outline of some of the features of the church complex, which I already reviewed, so we'll move on. And one of the key pieces of evidence we found during the excavation is a massive wall collapse of part of the church. And ironically, most archaeologists have a hard time dating the beginning of things. We had a hard time digging the end of things. 1578 seemed pretty secure in terms of the beginning of the site, given the El Nino evidence, and a little bit more I'll show you in a minute. But when did people stop living here? One of the things that makes Magdalena House special is the fact that people did not continue to live in this locale, which of course makes it difficult to do excavations in a modern town that is the outgrowth of an early colonial reduction. The fact that people left allows us to excavate there. Well, we don't have a precise date of when people left this area as a permanent site of residence, but we have some ideas. What we do know is that, again, thanks to colonial documents, that there was a massive earthquake that occurred on the coast of Peru in 1619, and it was reported that every adobe building on the coast of Peru collapsed during the earthquake of 1619. So is this massive wall collapse part of the 1619 disaster? We don't know for sure, but what we do know is there seems to have been a dramatic, catastrophic event that occurred at the church. The church fell into ruin, but the townspeople continued to stay in the village. Now looking out into the village, let's see why that might be. This is the way it looks today, and all of these different indentations are looters' holes. It's been described as it looks like a World War I battlefield or a bombing range, but it's part of what we live with. You can again see off in the distance these little mounds. Holes are from looting. This is a looter's pit that we squared off, and notice popping up along this line here are the stumps of a wattle and daub structure, which are still actually constructed and used today in Peru. This is a rather crude one because they didn't cut off the tops of the wattle, but and you'll find other walls better made. But this is probably what part of the Magdalena community looked like, the village part in its heyday. And it's just a simple process of creating a cane structure, where that's the wattle, and then plastering it with mud, that's the daub. In Spanish, it's called, in local Spanish at least, it's called quincha as the method, and it's still widely used today. So we got fancy and this is a ground penetrating radar, which is a high-tech device to detect underground features. So we tried that. We actually didn't have great success with the ground penetrating radar. We did a lot better simply taking our trowels and following the exposed lines of those quincha stubs wherever they led, and it resulted in this map of the town. And notice we have streets, we have avenues, and these little red blobs are actually parts of walls that we can work on building a more detailed view of what the town looked like, and a large empty space, a plaza in the middle, typical town plan. I will say that Larry Conyers from Denver University, who used his ground penetrating radar to look at the town, we went up to the top of the Waka here and helped find a Royal Moche burial. So we did use the GPR after all. It came in handy. And we concentrated our work beyond mapping the site in general using those techniques on 3 houses over the years. House 1, we sometimes call it Unit 1, House 2, and House 28. You might say, how did you get from 1 to 2 to 28? Well, yeah, we were overly ambitious. So I would email my colleagues saying, well, we'd like to lay out the following pits for the coming season. And of course, we never got to do as many as we thought. And so we actually didn't do, there are no houses 3 through 27. I mean, they're out there, but we never excavated them. We did 3, and it was substantial work. And those houses are interesting. They're actually house compounds, about 15 meters on a side. So they're about 45 meters on a side, and then relatively small spaces for indoor living, roofed areas, and then a larger area for outdoor activities, including cooking, keeping a few animals, and household chores. So what they look like, this is one view of them. House 2 here, and you can see the how that quincha comes out it's really an archaeologist's dream, because you just follow the quincha and there's the outline of the house. So here's the one corner of the house. This fellow here standing at an entryway, and you can see these are sort of the recintos, the small covered areas that would have been for sleeping and doing activities when the weather was cold. And this larger area here was a sort of a patio for outdoor activities. There's a street that separates these two houses, and have a similar pattern here in House 1. And the excavations went deep. We found, this is actually the living surface of the original colonial occupation, and you'll see that we have a first colonial occupation right on that surface there, which is on top of actually a pre-Columbian surface, and then a area of dense ash lenses, and then another layer on top of animal excrement and straw, a dense amount of animal excrement and straw. Let's see, there we go. And you can see here. And this is part of the history of the site. What happened was, it was a thriving town, and over the years, the town moved. So there were probably parts of the town where people just abandoned their houses and shifted their residences. And then gradually the economy of the region changed from being a more generic subsistence economy to specializing in goat and sheep herding. And this became a camp, a temporary camp for local goat herders who would use the old facilities for tending their flocks, and also leather working as well. Excavations of House 1, you can see one of those walls there. And artifacts. And I realize I'm already at half an hour and I've barely begun, so I'm going to speed up. We found a lot of artifacts, and of the two different houses, House 1 was a relatively rich and possibly devoutly Christian. So why do I say that? Well, we found items like this, which is an imported fragment of a crucifix. Of course, that could be just because people like them, but this is a handmade, hand-carved cross that was clearly done by somebody locally. So the degree to which local people had bought into Christianity seems to have varied, because interestingly enough, while there are indications of Christian practice in this house, and it has a lot of imported items like these metal items here, and glass beads and pins. House 1 is a much poorer house with fewer of these kinds of items, and also less overt signs of Christianity. The trouble in archaeology is one has to always be careful, because maybe the evidence was a pit away that we didn't excavate. Found the continuance of native practices, such as this is a chicha paddle. It's a broken chicha paddle. Chicha is the corn beer that is goes back to remote antiquity, still drunk today. Magdalena de cow makes the best chicha in Peru, they say, but I'm sure other places say the same. This is a moche pot showing chicha makers, and this chicha paddle was placed right next to the baptistry. It was clearly placed intentionally on the outside of the baptistry as an offering. Hard to say, but certainly chicha making never died. The Dominican friars who were part of the church seem to have had an understanding that this was a sacred brew of one kind or another. We worked in the garbage dump at the edge of town. So this is about the edge of town. The entire town stretches out here. Church in the distance. And in that garbage dump, we found the presence of spondylus shells. Spondylus shells are sometimes called a thorny oyster. They have this variety of them has a bright red exterior, and they're only found in the coastal waters of Ecuador. So every time you find a spondylus shell in Peru, they've traveled long distances to get where they are. North coast of Peru is closer than, obviously, the south coast of Peru. But nonetheless, their presence even here means long-distance travel. They were definitely associated with pre-Hispanic ideas of sacrality, and they, too, seem to be continued to be used, although perhaps in secret, because We found these in places that seem to be places which would have been outside of the view of the Spaniards. And in the garbage dump, we actually found examples of these being used in some kind of ritual in which a smoldering fire was created in a gourd, and then it was inverted with a beater or a spondylus fragment put into it, and then inverted and left in place in that area. So, excuse me, things were going on that were outside of view of the Spaniards, as well as activities that were clearly known to them. At the bottom of that garbage dump, by the way, we found these very sterile deposits, which are from rain runoff. We found insects trapped in the mud. So clearly, that's evidence of the 1578 El Nino. You might say, well, what about radiocarbon dates? Radiocarbon dates are just not precise enough to be able to date something like this, so I have to take it based upon the evidence, which is we have documentary and oral reports that happened in 1578, and this archaeology certainly conforms to that view. And we found a wide range of artifacts, ranging from paper cards and imported maiolicas. These are earthenware ceramics of a style that is European derived. One of the questions is when these eventually started to be made in Peru, but the history of them is they are styles that started off in the old world. They wound up being made in Panama. They're often called Panama wares. At what point were these no longer imported from Panama, but were being made locally, or at least being made in Lima? It's one of the ongoing studies. Archaeologists like to claim that they found the earliest something or other, right? I found the earliest cigarette butts. I think they're the earliest remains of cigarettes in existence. Now, I'm an ex-smoker, but I used to revel in the fact that, I actually tried to get Philip Morris to contribute to some analysis, and all I got were websites telling me to quit smoking, so I did. We have textiles. This wonderful preservation on the coast of Peru preserves textiles remarkably well. And we have mantles in indigenous styles using European techniques. We have textiles using indigenous techniques and quasi-traditional styles. There's a long tradition of painted textiles on the coast of Peru. And we have a distinctly colonial style of painted textile that includes imagery that may be European derived. We have sandals, we have shoes, we have socks, we have knitting, as my textile expert screamed out one day. We have knitting! Knitting was not known in the New World, it was imported. It's actually originally derived from the Middle East. But we have perhaps the earliest socks in the New World. So, I'm scoring big here. And we have many ceramics, as I already mentioned. We have Asian porcelains. A fascinating idea. Magdalena was a small, relatively minor community in the grand Spanish Empire, and yet, sometime in the late 16th, early 17th century, it's already being pulled in to this new capitalist world system of seeking exotic commodities. So we don't have a lot. We have maybe a dozen examples of Asian porcelains, but we have them in this tiny little community in virtually the middle of nowhere in the Spanish colonial period, showing the power of that early modern economic system that's drawing even remote communities into its consumerist worldview. This is an actual artifact found at the site. It's from a bottle like this, which is a colonial version of a pre-Hispanic pottery vessel. This is the finial on this vessel, now done in colonial style in ceramic with a green glaze. We have gourds that are done in traditional styles. These are called tokapu, often thought of as a relatively high-ranking symbolic medium, but we're seeing them on relatively poor people's gourds. And we have gourds carved in European styles. I like to call this the paradise gourd. It looks like a world of peace, the peaceable kingdom, animals and plants and flowers and people. We have gourds carved in styles reminiscent of Wampanoag, lots of bird imagery. This one's fascinating because it's a feline in a tree with a person. I think it's some kind of myth or legend or folk story. We have beads. We have metals of known, such as rings or tinklers or a folding knife, and unknown use, such as this gadget of unknown use. You're seeing different versions of it here. Metal boxes of unknown use. This is an ingot or perhaps a crude knife. Pins were extremely important and valued by native peoples, and one of the first mass-produced common item in both in Europe and in the New World that were eagerly sought. And we have evidence of the reaction to the written word, to documents. We have marked adobes from the church wall. I wish I could linger, but I've been told to speed up, so I'm going to speed up. And we have paper. Now, part of the reason I did this study was I was trying to get away from paper. If I may let it be known, when I was director in pre-Columbian studies at Dumbarton Oaks, I had to listen to a lot of historians. I hope I'm not offending anyone here, but a lot of historians sort of lording it over archaeologists for how much they don't know. And part of the reason I decided to do archaeology was of colonial period was to say, what can archaeology tell us? And what can archaeology tell us without paper involved? Well, unfortunately, or actually extremely fortunately, we ran into paper, thanks to that amazing preservation. And we have lots of different kinds of documents. We have handwritten documents, we have printed documents, we have music, we have playing cards. Sarah, my wife over there, nodding her head, has been studying the playing cards. We have fragments of written documents. This is a priest not known from the historical record, Friar Garcia de Haro, curate of the Doctrina, which means the church of the Magdalena abbreviated de Cao. So if that ain't the site, I don't know what it is. We have about total of 2,521 fragments of paper. Of course, if you tear one, we have more, the sample enlarges. We have these interesting cutouts. Now, one of the interesting things that happened was the site was abandoned, but no one came to pick up all the documents. The documents appear to have been left abandoned, and the church was abandoned, and the townspeople came and they mined the church for documents, and some of those documents they cut into butterflies or spears or masks or shapes that we can't figure out. We have fragments of indulgences. Now, in 1089, Pope Urban issued a decree that if people gave money to free the Holy Land from Muslim domination, contemporary issues here, they could get a piece of paper that certified they could spend less time in purgatory. Okay. This was extended in 1573 in the New World. So imagine this for a postmodern, actually pre-modern or contemporary modern view of things. These poor native peoples on the coast of Peru buying indulgences to have less time in purgatory to free the Holy Land, if they knew where that was. We have examples of a trilingual confessionary. This is the Quechua and Aymara being the main language in Bolivia, and the Spanish part's gone. We have a thesaurus from 1611. I'm just going to speed through this because I'm running out of time. We have writing practice. Who was learning how to write it? Right. Oh, and by the way, the reason why this is a thesaurus, this is a thesaurus of Latin Spanish. Why would you have a thesaurus of Latin Spanish at a Dominican friar's headquarters? Because not everybody was Spanish. The common language was Latin. Many of the people who were involved in the New World were not Spaniards. They were from other parts of Europe who had come and joined the adventure, as it were, And so Latin would have been the common language. Who was learning writing practice? Was it the novitiates of the church, or were they native peoples? I suspect that there were some native peoples being learned. We have a letter and a number list and an unknown language, a language that we've heard about, but we think this is the first evidence of that language, called Kingam. There were two major languages on the north coast of Peru when the Spaniards arrived. One we have a dictionary for, called Muchic, and the other one's called Kingam. There was a dictionary. It's somewhere around, but it's lost. I'm just going to skip the subsistence economy because I'm running out of time, but our evidence suggests that the people in the church were eating better than the people in the town. Surprise? No. And we have introduced plants of all sorts of kinds, but this is probably by the 18th century. The evidence seems to suggest that the town was occupied in some form into the 18th century. So part of the problem is how do we separate the earlier occupation of the town? Not enough time to go into it now, but basically the evidence suggests that the early subsistence economy was a much simpler one based upon local foods, thanks to finding this kitchen area intact with vessels in the floor still filled with powdered remains that we analyzed to indicate that the diet of the townspeople was basically potatoes, maize, and seafood. Last but not least, it was not just the natives and the Spaniards. There were many other peoples, including Africans, in this valley, even by the early 1600s. This is the evidence, the cranium of an African young man who was found at the site, unfortunately in very bad context. It was lying in a looted area, and his diet is completely different than the diet of the townspeople, suggesting that we have other lines of evidence that he was born in Africa and he died at Magdalena. It is either the earliest or it ties with the earliest physical evidence of an African in the New World. So, not with a bang but a whimper, the town gradually changed. It was moved from here in El Brujo, 4 kilometers north, where Magdalena exists today. And that's my story. I'm sticking to it. There's a lot to go into here. The reason why I'm at BARD is because I need help in identifying all those gadgets. So I hope to do so partly while I'm here. Thanks very much for your attention, and I hope there's time for questions.
All right, he's left us a few minutes for questions. So.
Sorry.
You had said that the church was in the plaza of an older temple.
Yes.
So I was just wondering whether you did any excavations on the older temple and whether there was an associated, even older town next to the temple.
Oh, that's a great question. My Peruvian colleagues have been excavating that main temple for, about 20 years. They found a lot. I just couldn't go into it. And there is evidence of a town between the two temples, but it's between the two. The evidence suggests that in front of the temple, where the colonial town was placed, was not part of the prehistoric town. It might have been a cemetery. I think it is, but we've not gone down because it'd be too much work. Yes.
Can I ask now, since you were with the museum, so now what happens with all these artifacts? Who owns them? Where they go?
Good question. They're owned by the Peruvian government, and the Brujo complex has been supported by a foundation, which is actually an investment company in Lima called the Fundación Vice, Weiss Foundation. And they've helped support my work, they've helped support the Peruvian archaeologists who are permanently resident, and they built a museum, so the collections are in that museum. Yeah, it's not shown some of the pictures because I was using some earlier slides. The museum only opened a couple of years ago. Yes?
So what's the length of the nave of the church?
Oh, good question.
Because it looks very large.
It is, it's very long.
Is that by a large population or no?
That's another good question. I don't remember the exact length of the nave. There's a very old church in Trujillo called Church of Mansiche, and it's almost the exact same length and width as the Mansiche Church. I would hate to gather a guess. Well, one of the interesting questions is, I don't know how many people in the church. I don't. There's a lot of mystery on that. I was once in the highlands of Ecuador, and I went to a church service, and a lot of the townspeople didn't go in the church. They stood outside. They heard the service, but they didn't go inside. So we do have figures, historical figures, that the population of the town at its height, which would have been probably in the first third of the 17th century, was probably about 2,000. Very good population. Yeah.
What is the purpose of that double connected bridge bottle?
Purpose. Well, we don't really know. A lot of those double chambered vessels are whistling vessels. A lot of these objects, a lot of these fancy pots from ancient Peru seem to be objects of virtue in and of themselves. They were used for funeral rites. They were used. It was the commoditization of religion by creating these objects that people wanted and brought back from the temples as basically kind of souvenirs and as representations of having been to the temple. I think. I mean, most of the fancy pots don't have a specific use other than to be what they are. Yes.
Yeah, so they're continuing to use adobe. So one of the questions I had is how distinct were the various reducciones in various parts of Peru?
The reducciones were probably, that's a very interesting question because the concept of the reducción was actually invented in Columbus's time. So the idea that we're going to take native peoples and we're going to force them, or we're going to encourage them to live in a town, and it's going to be on a Spanish plan, was worked out in very precise details, and the reducción was organized, but the church should be right here, and the mayor's house should be right here. It was down to the last detail of how it should be organized. And again, my colleague Tom Cummins at Harvard's written an interesting article on reducciones. Now, because so many reducciones are under modern towns, it's often very hard to say. There hasn't been a lot of excavations of colonial archaeology in general, or of reducciones in specific. Magdalena is a little complicated because it's technically not a reducción. It's technically a refugee community. They were in a reducción, a 1560s reducción, and got wiped out and removed. And my impression is that they got to the terrace and they set up shop, and they didn't necessarily conform to the reducción. They just put their buildings where they wanted to put them, and no one ever forced them back. I think one of the lessons we're getting, not just from archaeology, but also from more sophisticated and more detailed historical investigations these days, is that you had the official way things should be, as is usually the case in most things, and as we hope will be in the current situation. You have the official way things should be done, and then you have the way things actually people do them, which are not necessarily the same thing. One of the things I find fascinating about colonial Peru, I used to be a purist. I was one of those, I only want to work on pre-Columbian societies, unsullied by, Europe. Now I think it's the most fascinating thing around because it is this amazing mixture and not just mixture, you can use all these words of hybridity and so forth, but this salad of different kinds of people and different kinds of ideas and things going on. It was kind of like our Wild West, only in a different place at a different time. So we don't know.
Yeah, okay, so I guess to clarify what I was
Oh, you want to know about the adobes in particular?
Yeah, well, I was wondering, in the pre-Columbian time, some communities are using stone, other communities are using adobe depending on their environment. And is there any indication that they were varied in that way in different portions of Peru?
Yes, I think I hazard a guess, I think they were. I mean, even in regionally, it was a big deal to get bricks, get European-style bricks and import them. And there's actually a case we have about Magdalena that a priest, a local priest, after the Dominicans had left, there was still a local priest who came by, and he got money from Spain to help rebuild the town. They were supposed to rebuild the church. And he used the money instead to buy bricks and for his trapiche, for his mill that he had to squeeze sugarcane. People. Yes.
I'm curious about the papers you found, the
Yes.
documents. Were they all found in a specific region in the church, or
Good
were they
question.
scattered?
Excellent question.
widely?
Yes, there were a lot of papers found around the exterior of the church compound. And it seems to me that what happened is the townspeople went in and they were literally at some point mining and chucking things over, and they didn't care about a lot of these papers, so they wound up in these dense deposits around the edge of the church compound. We did find papers. We found about 2/3 of the papers found in the church, about 1/3 of the papers are found in the town, and those cutouts are found in the town. So they did take some papers and bring them back. And native peoples are in awe of writing. Not necessarily so. One piece of paper is used for toilet paper. And some of them are cutouts. So I think, the attitude of these people, indigenous people, towards the written word was complicated and was not uniform in any way.
You mentioned the cura de la doctrina.
Yeah.
I think that's a very specific role.
Yes.
It's actually the catechization of the,
Yes.
of the natives.
Well, they would often, almost every reduction was commonly referred to as a doctrina because they were all involved in,
No, but the cura de la doctrina
was a particular role.
You also mentioned a plan, you mentioned avenues and streets, and although, as you said, it's a refugee camp almost, but still they had this very...
They did.
Yeah, and you know that in other parts, of course, of the New World, we have plans that were kind of utopian plans. Like
Yes.
Franciscans, for instance, like in Morelos in Mexico, Playa Capa, was all actually planned in terms of some kind of extraordinary, esoteric idea. So I wonder if here there is any sense of that there was by the Dominicans, which was different.
I think if there was, they never got to initiate it because, one of the issues is how many Dominicans were present, and were they there permanently? I think I think over the 200-year period of occupation, it changed, and if we say, well, definitely was a radical change in 1619, then we're dealing with a shorter period of time, but it's still very difficult to say. We do know, and obviously for want of time, we do know that in the 1770s, the head cacique of Magdalena went to Spain and wrote a long document, which we have preserved, in which he said he wanted money to restore, they still wanted money to restore the church because the sacraments and the holy statues and the other, materials of the church were being kept in a small hut in the middle of the plaza. And we actually dug in the middle of the plaza to see if there's any trace, but there wasn't. It must have been Quilter.
So, well, first of all, I can tell you, you're making the minds among us, very jealous.
I'm seething with
They're twitching now because of the great preservation you have. But I want to go back to the sort of urban planning of the whole site. So we have Huacacao Viejo, and the church, the Colonial Church, is in the plaza of Huacacao Viejo. So there's no orientation then to the Huaca Cortada. There's no, in the colonial period, there's no engagement with that twin Huaca, right?
No, don't think so. You know, so there's a, Rebelo Franco, my co-director of the project, proving co-director of the project, who I should recognize, told me that they went to the top of the Waka Cal Viejo, the one near the site, and they found a big hole, a big round hole. And there was some, I can't remember what the source is, but there was some source somewhere that said that when the Spaniards arrived, they put a big wooden cross on top of the Waka. So there's that. Now the other little issue is the Waka Cortada is called the Waka Cortada because there's a huge trench in the middle of it. Nobody knows when that's made, when that was made. It could have been buried away. You want to end?
I'm sorry. Yeah, we are out of time, and I know some people have other obligations, but
That's certainly. Well, I can stick around and talk.
Yeah.
And I will say though that if you'd like to, if you want a different perspective on some other things, another talk's coming up on Moche on March 9th. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.